This live stream event is presented with support from Beneficial State Bank. Hey everyone, my name is Nathalie Baptiste, and I'm a reporter and columnist for Mother Jones in Washington, D.C. I just want to take a moment to welcome you all to this Mother Jones live stream event. We've got a really great program for you today. So right now, we're at a pivotal moment in history considering the pandemic and the Black Lives Matter movement. You know, with Trump gone, a lot of us are wondering what's next in the fight for justice. You know, we have a new president who says he's committed to fighting for racial justice, environmental justice, addressing inequality, and fixing our democracy. But what does all of that mean? What do we need to know? And really, what do we do with all this newfound energy? And I can't think of anyone better to talk to about all of this than our guest today. Now, a lot of you may already know the Reverend Dr. William J. Barber II, but how many of you know that he also has two cool-ass daughters, Dr. Sharrelle Barber and Rebekah Barber? These three are uniquely positioned to make sense of everything that's going on right now. And it really just feels like we've never been more prepared for this fight than we are right now. So for me, the first time I saw the Reverend speak was in 2014, before I was even at Mother Jones, and just watching him weave together the injustices of poverty and racism and inequality, I was like, wow, this guy's like the real deal. So I'm kind of hoping that this experience will be the same for you, and you have the bonus of having his two daughters with us. So let's all give a warm welcome to the Reverend Dr. William J. Barber II, who is, among many other things, co-director of the Poor People's Campaign, and his daughters, Dr. Sharrelle Barber, who's a social epidemiologist, and Rebekah Barber, who's currently getting her master's in public policy at Duke University. Hey guys, so glad you could be here with us.
Thanks so much for having us.
Yeah, thank you so much. Glad to be here.
Thank you for bringing us together in this this COVID way. And let me first give a shout out to you, Nathalie, for the work you do, and thank you for your commitment, tireless commitment to the truth and journalism. And then I just want to lift up Mother Jones. You know, her spirit is with us today. You know, Mother Jones didn't play. Mother Jones said, look, you pray for the living, but the dead, but you fight like hell for the living. And
that's right.
She's one of the spirits that I live with often as a way of encouraging me in the great cloud of witnesses. So I want to lift that. And that she was a white sister, but she stood for, you know, against slavery. She stood for abolition. She stood for women's suffrage. And so, yo, what up, Mother Jones? We're glad you're with us.
Thanks so much, Reverend. So the first question I want to ask you guys is really important. Show of hands, who's sick of doing events on Zoom?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. You know, but in some ways, you know, for the church, it's actually teaching us something. I would never want this because of COVID, but you know, the church has had to leave the building, and I've been like, yes, you know, I mean, you know, we've had to literally think in new ways of being community, and we've had to do what our foreparents had to do to survive. You know, they couldn't use the regular railroad, so they created an underground railroad. You know, they couldn't sing about their freedom up front, so they learned to incorporate it into their spirituals and their gospels. So in some ways, you know, even at Greenleaf, I mean, in the midst of COVID, we went from having 500-600 people online on Sunday to upwards of 25,000 people in 48 states and 20 some countries around the world, from Japan to Croatia to Russia to 10 or 12 countries in Africa. So tired in one sense, but also learning in another sense. And I don't think we're going to be the same. I think I hope we're learning that, for me at least, the church was never meant to merely be in the building, right? We're learning new ways of activism. You know, last year, June 2020, we were planning a mass Poor People's Campaign march, National Mall March on Washington. I mean, a mass Poor People's Assembly Mall March on Washington. We were going to cancel because COVID said, in fact, our advisors, Dr. Barber and others said, but the poor and lower people said, well, okay, but we still need to have it. And so we did. 2.7 million people showed up, Nathalie.
Wow.
2.7 million people. So when we talk about, you know, the new administration, Black Lives Matter, let's put in their Poor People's Campaign, National Call for Moral Revival as well. And they were from Appalachia to Alabama. People were able to bring together, even through Zoom, that never would have been in communication and conversation as well. So tired in one sense, but also learning in another sense. Yeah.
Definitely, definitely. There are certainly some upsides to Zoom. So, I really wanted to get started with just being a little bit personal, just so our audience can really learn more about you guys and kind of your fun family dynamic that I've already gotten to witness. So, Rebekah, I wanted to start with you, actually. Can you tell us a story about growing up that'll really reveal what it was like in your household?
I mean, I guess not necessarily a story, but I gained the reputation in my family of being the one who would always like stand up to my dad if I had something to say. And I learned how to argue, I learned how to be strong, but my brothers and my sister, they'd be like, Rebekah, maybe you should sit this one out. But if I had something to say, I would make sure I said it. And my dad actually cultivated that in me. And we came to the conclusion, oftentimes it wasn't necessarily that I was wrong or he was wrong, but we were coming from our different perspectives. And we kind of found a way to meet in the middle. But yeah, I had the reputation of being the one who would just, very outspoken. It's interesting because I'm the smallest one in size. I'm only 5 feet tall. But I learned how to really just, if I have something to say, I'm going to say it. And it was a good environment to learn that in. So now I've been in environments where I have to advocate for certain things, sometimes to the opposition, but I'm not afraid. So yeah.
And what about you, Dr. Sharrelle? Do you agree with that? What did you learn? What's your reputation?
I don't know. Me and my sister have this thing between us. We're fire and ice. I tell, folks, Rebekah's the fire, I'm the ice. But, I think that is true. Very, very true that we all have come at the work of justice and in different ways. And I appreciate, and we all appreciate that both our father and our mother have allowed us to cultivate that and help us to find our own voices, right? So really inspired by our father and his work, but he has definitely, let us go on our own journeys and let us cultivate our gifts and do the work and find ways to connect to the movement, right? So for me, it's been really powerful in the middle of the pandemic to be a part of the COVID-19 Health Justice Advisory Committee for the Poor People's Campaign and use my skills as an epidemiologist to inform the work of the movement, right? And so that's been really, really powerful. And to have space to be able to do that, again, that's something that we have been given since we were younger.
Definitely, definitely. And so this question is for both of you, really. And don't worry, Reverend, we'll get to you eventually.
Oh no,
but...
I'm just as fine. Don't worry.
Can either of you recall a moment when you realize, hey, this guy I called dad is kind of important, and what did that feel like?
Yeah, I remember because I was the type of person growing up, I would always read autobiographies, and I had a huge reverence for members of SNCC. And I remember one year, Julian Bond was the chairman of the NAACP, and I believe my dad was on the national board. And just seeing him walk over and have a conversation with Julian Bond and seeing the reverence that many people that I admire, of course I admire my dad, but seeing how SNCC elders embraced him, that was really pivotal for me. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think, Dad's work has been phenomenal. I've appreciated the work he's done as a pastor at our home church in Goldsboro. The ways in which he has, he just loves people, but I think for me, the recent event that did it for me was at the DNC, which was in Philadelphia in 2016, and we were watching it as a family on television, and we all kind of looked at each other because he spoke truth to power in that moment. And I think it was necessary for that to happen. But once that happened, and once we saw the the spirit catch on in the DNC in Philadelphia in the convention center, we knew that, he was going to be an important voice, especially as we navigated the last 4 years. And so I think so many instances, but I think that for us as a family, we recognized that his voice was needed in the country and around the world. So
definitely. Now, Reverend Barber, you've heard your daughters talk about you. Do you feel like what you were trying to impart on them worked? Do you feel like you've done your job here?
Still trying to do it. Still trying to do it every day. But my children inspire me. The truth of the matter, my daughters, my sons. Couple of stories. One is when I got a pretty serious death threat. Actually, it said I had gone to the North Carolina General Assembly, 7 other clergy, to challenge Tom Tillis, who's in the Senate now, this was even before he passed the worst voter suppression law in the country. But he was passing this radical budget, this very extreme budget that was going to hurt children. And we stood up he wouldn't meet with us. So we stood up in the area where you sit, I forget the name of it, and said, "What doth the Lord require?" Just asked that question. And he said, "Get them out of my house." I was like, "Your house? This is a people's house." And we said it again. So he had us arrested. And the next day, a threat came in that said, it was referencing Obama, referencing me, and it said, "You'll be dead by Christmas. You're in the death pool." And, I've tried to protect my children from a lot of that. I mean, this is even different for us, because for a number of things. And I shared it with them. And I never forget when kind of collectively in their own way, they all said, "Well, Daddy, as long as you're out here fighting to help others, you won't have to worry about us. We're going to take care of each other. We're going to make sure each other get our schoolwork. We're going to make sure each of us get scholarships. We're going to do this as a commitment too, because we understood." That meant that was inspiring to me. I remember when Rebekah was diagnosed with hydrocephalus as a very young child. And I remember the strength that she showed in that moment. The doctor said that she was so strong right after the surgery that she wouldn't lay down and had to have somebody lay in the bed with her. But I remember the day when she said, "I've got to speak today." It was about voting. And I was like, "Nah." She said, "Daddy, you taught me," because what she was talking about, I was taught, my father would tell me when it was sun up, he would say it was raining, just to create an argument, to teach us how to debate, right? So I did the same thing with them. But anyway, she said, "Daddy, listen, it's a blessing for me to be here. These folk are going after me." She did the same thing in the healthcare debate. I remember when she asked Kay Hagan in the Senate room, "Do you want people like me to die?" She looked her right in the face, the senator. She wrote and challenged Ben Carson, say, "You operate on me. Well, I'm one of your patients. What is wrong?" She questioned that. That was inspiring to me, right? And the sense that with Sharrelle, I remember when she got ready to, you learn whether your teachings work by what your children do. So, she graduated valedictorian. She was the first African-American student to graduate valedictorian from this high school in Eastern North Carolina. And she had all these offers. I mean, a lot of offers to go to different schools. And she met Janetta Cole at Bennett. Janetta was coming to revive Bennett College. And she met with her. And Janetta Cole didn't have a scholarship. She told Sharrelle, she said, "I don't have a scholarship to offer you." And she said, "But I'll help you. Even if you don't come here, I'll meet with you. I'll give you guidance on the side." Now, as a father and somebody who doesn't have a lot of money, I'm saying, "Okay, baby, you got to take the scholarship somewhere." She comes home one day and says to me, "I think I need to go to Bennett." And I was like, "Oh, okay, now, what do you mean? You got all these scholarships, they don't have a scholarship." And I said that in a nice way. And she said, "Well, how are they ever going to attract the valedictorian if they don't have one?" And then she said, "Didn't you teach us that we're supposed to use our gifts to help others?" So when your children start preaching back to you, so at that point I had to say, okay, if it means that you got to get the loans, we're going to move in this. And we were prepared to do that. And literally the day that she was standing in line, and this is the other thing she reminded me, Daddy, you're the one that said walk by faith. Day she was in the line, a wealthy donor called Dr. Cole and gave her 2 scholarships for any students that she wanted. And Dr. Cole sent a runner over to the line to pull Sharrelle out of the line and another young lady and say that these 2 scholarships would go. But we would have never had that experience without her leaning into this notion that I've tried to teach to them, that life is not so much about what you do for you, but how do you use your gifts for the uplift of all humanity. Now that creates a lot of struggle sometimes. But I don't teach my daughters not to struggle. I don't teach them just to bow down to somebody because they're a man or because they're older or because, they'll tell you, I will challenge things and they'll all through their life, I'll take the opposite side because and say, I'm going to take the opposite side, because if you're going to believe it, you need to know why you believe it, and you need to be able to challenge it, and you need to be able to stand flat-footed. And so if anyway, when I see them in places, they actually, they inspire me to keep this old guy going. Really do. They really do.
You mentioned that your father would tell you that it was raining out when it was sunny, just to start an argument to teach you how to debate.
Start a debate. Yeah,
just how to debate.
Right, yeah, right.
I would love to hear more, really, about lessons from your father.
Yeah, well, my dad, he took a vow of poverty to come back home. He left Indianapolis. My father, their grandfather, we come from a free community on his side, in free union, with blacks, mulatto blacks, Native Americans, and white. He went to school at Elizabeth City State. He was drafted into the Navy. He then came out afterwards and went to St. Aug. He left St. Aug. He went to Warrenton, Georgia. He taught in Warrenton, Georgia. He was kind of like a vice principal, a teacher, and a basketball coach. He had a sheriff put a gun in his face because he wrote articles. This is in the 50s, and said, I will kill you because you think you're one of those curly haired, light skinned, da, 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 da. And he had to stand up, to that. And then he went to Indiana to get trained at Butler University and CTS. And then he decided he got a call to come back home because the schools in Eastern North Carolina, even after 63, 64, 65, had not desegregated. Some of them didn't desegregate until 1970. And he left what was like a career going to go back home to Eastern North Carolina. And he and my mother ended up being a major force in training and preparing people and integrating the system. And he also worked on the side of laborers in the local warehouse, pulp mill. Some of them, black folk, were getting paid less than white people. He worked with farmers. He stayed in Eastern North Carolina. He could have gone anywhere. I tell people he was like a walking genius. If you go back into old who's in America, who's who in Black America, he's in all of those books. And early on, but he taught us that whatever you have is not a place from which you stand upon to look down on people. It's gifts. When I was headed to college, one day he called me outside, and he didn't have a lot of money because of the vows he took and the decisions he made, but he had some people outside in the circle. Ms. Verna May, he had a guy named Totter Bottle. These nicknames, I can't remember all of them. He had them in a circle. He told me, get in the middle of them. And he said, you owe God for all the gifts you have that you didn't ask for. They just came with the package. And you owe all these people who are just as smart as you. They just didn't get. Don't you ever think that the opportunity you have is because you were the first one to have the ability to do it. No, you just the first one that got the access. That's all. And you owe this community. He was serious about that. And on the debating piece, he would say that in a debate, you have to know your adversary's argument too. You can't just know what you believe. You have to know history. That's why when you say you hear me weaving history, he taught me that. And I learned that from people like Sierra Lincoln and John Hope Franklin and Thorpe, who were some of my early teachers and that taught me. But he said you have to be able. And I was glad he did, because last story I'll tell you is when I went to Duke, I had a professor named Dr. Turner. He was teaching us about all of the sermons that are in the stacks at Harvard and Yale and Duke that were pro-slavery, not back people in the backwoods, but literally theologians and preachers that argued pro-slavery, right? And so we had an exercise in the class one day, and Dr. Turner said, I want the white students to preach the sermons that are pro-abolition, and I want the Black students to preach the sermons that are pro-slavery. And I remember my daddy's lesson, because a lot of the Black students said, I ain't gonna do it, I ain't gonna do it. But my daddy taught me, know that other side. If you're gonna tear it apart, know it. And so I took it to heart, and I went inside of those sermons, and I tried to get behind the logic. And that's when I came to the conclusion that this whole thing about systemic racism is not just about feeling. It's not just about name calling. It literally is a false form of religion. Mm. It's a form of idolatry. It's theological malpractice. It's a form of heresy. And it plays itself out in policy. And if you don't get that and look at it that way, then you just think, oh, it's just some misguided person that every now and then calls somebody the N-word. That's the problem we have right now. People are saying with the Republicans, they're saying, well, these Republicans, and they don't agree with the other people. Why won't they challenge it? You cannot challenge what you are. What we are seeing in this country right now is not capitulation, it's concurrence. They concur with what Trump did. It didn't start with him, right? There's people today we're saying are moderates were the extremists who were birthers last 2-3 years ago. And then they were the Southern strategists that started with Howard Dent and Kevin Phillips and Richard Nixon, who said in 1968, we must divide the country. That must be our goal, especially in the South. It's the only way we can hold power. So what we're seeing today is us, America. It's not all of America. And republicanism, they keep saying, well, there's no such thing as moderates. That's the 1950s Republicans that signed off on the Voting Rights Act. Ever since Nixon and the Southern strategy, what we now have is a plan that was set in place in 68, post the Civil Rights Movement, to deliberately divide the country. And it has just grown and grown and grown and grown. You have sown to the wind, you're reaping the whirlwind. Until there is a repentance of that, then you're going to keep trying to blame it on a congressman from Georgia or a president from New York and suggest that these are anomalies, when it is not an anomaly. It is the very anatomy of Republican politics. Now, I got criticisms for the Democrats right now, but I'm just talking about that issue.
Definitely. And, speaking of systemic racism, I wanted to switch gears a little bit and talk about the pandemic. As everyone knows, really, the pandemic has been disproportionately affecting, working class people of color. And now even, we have a vaccine, and even that distribution, we're already seeing the racial inequality. So, Dr. Sharrelle, I really wanted to ask you if you could kind of connect the dots for us. How does public health play into the civil rights movement?
Absolutely. Well, like you said, what we're seeing with the pandemic, unfortunately, was not a surprise to many of us who've been studying, how structural racism influences health and health inequities. And if you look at the top, top 10, causes of mortality in this country, Black Americans have the highest rates, even before COVID, right? So what we're seeing with COVID is not a surprise. We know that over 55,000 Black Americans have died due to COVID. And we know that it's not that we are just dying at higher rates, that we are also dying at younger ages. So there's some data out of Harvard from one of my colleagues, one of the members of the COVID Health Justice Committee, that shows that mortality rates for working class Black and Brown individuals are 7 to 9 times their white counterparts. 7 to 9 times. And so we know that workers are being the most exposed, the least protected, and then they are not only exposed themselves, but that also puts their families at risk, right? So we're seeing the interlocking systems of racism come together with regard to housing, with regard to work, with regard to limited access and discrimination within the healthcare system, right? all of that's playing a role. All of that dates back to policies that have been put in place for decades and decades and decades. And so we're seeing the confluence of that in this pandemic. And with regard to the vaccine, it's just following those same fissures, those same inequities, right? That have to do, yes, with mistrust, and a mistrust that is grounded in reality. And so we have to acknowledge that there has been racism and horrific atrocities by the healthcare system for decades, that as well as current day atrocities and discrimination and mistrust within the healthcare system that are making folks hesitant to take the vaccine. And we have to acknowledge that history, acknowledge the present moment, but there's also access barriers that we can't afford to look away from. And so thinking about just some basic things that we're seeing in terms of the sign up for the vaccine is online, and folks having barriers to actually signing up because they may not have internet access, or it's taking hours for them to sign up. Well, everybody doesn't have hours on in or just to wait for a sign up for, signing up for the vaccine, where the locations for the vaccine distribution are located. And then the fact that when we are trying to, address equity and place vaccination clinics within poor Black communities or Latino communities, that white folks are coming in and taking up those appointments for the very communities that are hit the hardest by the pandemic, right? So we're seeing this reinforcement of these inequities, this racism play out within the pandemic. And unless we plan and are proactive, we're going to continue to see these inequities be exacerbated as this continues to go on. And we have to address this head on. But it's a part of the system. It's a part of the structure. And we know, and some of the work that I do and my colleagues do, we say racism is deadly, not just in the vicious and violent ways we see with folks like George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and others, but in these insidious ways. Racism has been killing us, and it's killing us during this pandemic.
Yeah. Definitely.
Nathalie, can I jump in on that question?
Of course.
The other piece of this, when we look at it, and we talk about the disaggregations, as Sharrelle said, COVID exposed the fissures of systemic racism, systemic poverty. We had 140 million people living in poverty and low before COVID, and not a word from any party in a real way for years on poverty and low wealth. If you think about it, Republicans tend to racialize poverty, Democrats tend to run from poverty. Democrats talk about neoliberalism from the middle up, Republicans talk about from the top down. But there has not been a national debate or discussion on the issue of poverty and low wealth that before COVID affected almost 45% of the country. 66 million of that 140 million were white, 26 million were Black, but the 26 million Black represents 60% of our population, right? 87 million people before COVID, either uninsured or underinsured. Think about that. People working, 62 million people working for less than living wages. Tip wages, workers, and tips grow out of the legacy of post-slavery. Millions and millions of people working for $2.10. Then tips, 70% of them women, 60% couldn't get unemployment when they lost their jobs because they didn't make the base pay to qualify for employment. We attach healthcare to people's jobs, not to their body and their humanity. So, and then before COVID, we talk about death now, but the problem that we have in this country, we waited too long to deal with the issue of death. Because before COVID, 700 people dying a day from poverty. 700 people a day. 7 people died from vaping. We had a White House conference. We had a congressional briefing. 7 people died from vaping. 700 people were dying from poverty, right? So every regressive policy has a DM on the DL, a death measurement on the down low. And America is going to have to decide on that death is no longer an option, not just when we see it grossly depicted on camera, which we have to respond to, but all of those deaths that aren't happening on camera that are just as dead. The people are just as dead. And it's a form of violence, political and policy violence. Now, but in the midst of all this, the measurement that we've not done in the midst of all this is how COVID is affecting poor and low wealth people. Now you think about that. Poor and low wealth. So even when you say Black people are dying, there's another disaggregation. Who? With Black people? What Black people? What communities? Right? How is this thing affecting poor Black folk in Alabama, poor white folk in Appalachia, poor Latinos on the farmlands, and poor, say, Apache and other natives in Arizona and other places? America, even now, that disaggregation has not really been done. Think about that now. And we know that 8 million more people fell into poverty, according to the faulty government poverty line, from May to November. So we may be very well at this country, if you do the right measurement, we may be right now at close to 50% of Americans being in poverty. We know that only 39% of Americans can afford $1,000 emergency today, right now. So 61% can't. And yet we're not looking at this through the lens of poverty. What we do know is the poor and low wealth, Black, brown, indigenous, white, were the first to get exposed. They were the first to be forced to go to work. They were the first to go to work with low wages, the first to have to work without health care and without sick leave and without decent unemployment, the first to go into hospitals, the first to die, and now they're the last to get relief and the last to get vaccinated. Even the bills that we passed that were quote unquote bipartisan, 84% of the first bills went to corporations and banks. And so in this moment, we have to have a lens that deals with systemic racism and poverty, right? That dual lens. And we have to build a movement that brings people together, that shows that the very people, and this is my last point, the very people, Nathalie, for instance, that have blocked fixing the Voting Rights Act for over 2,700 days. You think about that. So the very people that blocked that are the same people that made sure businesses and corporations got trillions of dollars, but they fight to just give people and poor and low wealth people basic health care and basic protection. So the very people who benefit from racist voter suppression to get into office, once they get into office, they use their power in a way that hurts all poor and low wealth Americans. We've got to build that unity, that fusion understanding in this moment in order to change things.
Definitely. And with everything that's going on right now, with the new administration is yet another opportunity to maybe get it right this time. And Dr. Sharrelle, Rebekah, I would love to hear from you guys on kind of what you think the top 3 actions the Biden administration could take in his first year to kind of advance the cause of justice.
I would like to take this first.
You see what I'm talking about? Okay.
I haven't spoken in a while. Well, as my dad mentioned earlier, healthcare access is very important to me. I had early access at a young age. And because of that, I'm sitting here before you. I've never had any complications, so we need to make sure everyone has access to healthcare. As my dad was saying just a few minutes ago, there are essential workers, who don't have access to healthcare. People lost access to healthcare because it was tied to their job, and I don't think this is a piecemeal thing. There's the death measurement my dad was just mentioning. We need to ensure that everyone has access to healthcare. I'm sitting here as proof, early access can save lives. And too often by the time people have access to care, it's too late. So that's number 1. Number 2, as we've mentioned before, raising the minimum wage. I know there's a bill being proposed to raise it, to 15, but that wouldn't take full effect until 2025. And every year we wait, the value is diminishing and diminishing. So those are, the top 2 definitely for me. Number 3, I guess I would have to think on it a little bit more. Ayanna Pressley had a really powerful tweet the other day. She said, student loans, that would do a lot for Black women in particular. So yeah, I mean, those would be the top three. But any issue really, with any issue can be viewed with a racial equity lens, and that's what I would hope the Biden administration would do. As my father often says, live from the bottom. Put people who are most impacted at the forefront.
And can I slide a piece of history in here just for Sharrelle on what she said about the health? Every congressperson, every senator gets free health care.
That's it.
Paid for by us. All they have to do is get elected. The most immoral thing about it is for people who get something free by the people who elected them, but then they don't want the people to have the same thing. And we're the only of the top 20 industrialized countries that do this. We're the wealthiest country in that. I mean, I just want to slip that bit of history in there. And it was not Obama's idea. It was actually Teddy Roosevelt's idea in 1912. So we are 108 years behind on this. 108 years. On the living wage, and I'll come back to it, but I just want to shoot this piece of history in there. In the March on Washington, one of the agenda items was $2 an hour minimum wage, which today, based on inflation and whatnot, would be 15. So again, we're 57 years late. We're 57 years late, right? That people are working, 62 million people. If we did that immediately, 49 million people would be raised up out of poverty and low wealth. And in excess of 40-some% or 50-some% of Black people make less than a living wage. So don't talk to me about racial equity if you aren't willing to talk to me about economic justice. And it would not decrease jobs, it would build jobs, and it would pump $300-some-odd billion into the economy. And so I just want to slip those two little pieces of history in there to say that we can't forget this stuff. We've been fighting too long for this stuff, and everybody ought to ask themselves, what would meeting this pandemic have been like if those things had been in place? So I'll come back later. So, I'm sorry. Rebecca's looking at me cross-eyed, and so.
No, but I'll just add one more point. And actually, this is a nod to our brother William, who does work in the climate space and climate environmental justice. We've got to be focusing on climate, in this moment. And if we don't do, the pandemic, caught us unawares, if you will. We were not prepared. But we know that the climate crisis is actually here for many of us. And so if we don't deal with climate and also deal with climate from an economic and a racial justice lens, right? The communities who are going to be most impacted, who are already most impacted, we're going to be stuck talking about these inequities, still. And so we've got to be more proactive, not just reactive. That's what we found in this pandemic, because we could have saw again, we predicted inequities by all of these dimensions of race and class, et cetera. But again, those fissures existed. And so they operated in the way that they were set up to operate. And so if we can use this as a lesson, this moment as a lesson to plan for the crises that lie ahead, and again, center poor folks, center Black folks, Indigenous folks, brown folks who are most directly impacted, we need to be doing that in this moment.
Just to add to that,
okay.
I'm sorry.
It's getting ready to start. Okay. Go ahead, Rebecca.
Just to add to that, when you were talking, Sharrelle, you made me think of the quote by James Farmer, and I can't quote it correctly, but he said, if we don't address the climate crisis, what else will matter? Because we will all be extinct eventually, So yeah, I do agree. That should take priority as well.
And Nathalie, one of the things we've said in the Poor People's Campaign is we first have to agree, when we hear people talk about the soul of America, okay, what's really breaking and causing the problem with the soul? And we've said it's systemic racism, but we list it in all of its forms, how it affects Black people, brown people, Indigenous people, so forth. Secondly is systemic poverty. Third is ecological devastation / denial of health care. Fourth is the war economy, because we could take just 10% of the bloated military budget and fix a lot of this stuff. Because we spend 54 cents of every discretionary dollar onto the war economy, most of it going to military contractors, and less than 16 cents on infrastructure, education, healthcare, and wages. Think about that. Of an $800 billion budget, you could cut our military budget. Technically, you could cut it to $350 billion, and we would still have more money, right, than about 5 or 6 countries combined, right? And then the false moral narrative of religious nationalism and white evangelicalism that's actually telling many of these politicians it's immoral to help the poor. It's immoral to get health care. So those we say are the 5 interlocking injustices. And what the Poor People's Campaign did when we met with the Biden domestic policy team, we took 32 people on a Zoom call. They first wanted just a couple. We said, we don't roll like that. They said, well, who do you want to bring? We said, we wanted to bring a white farmer. We wanted to bring black folk from Alabama. We wanted to bring indigenous people from Arizona. We wanted to bring fast food workers. We want them in the room with economists, with lawyers. And we said that, listen, the Constitution, it says clearly, you don't even have to go to the Bible. I can point a lot of scripture there, but the Constitution says you cannot ensure domestic tranquility unless you start with the establishment of justice. And so we said that if you're going to heal the soul of the nation, you have to address the sickness in the body. And the sickness in the body is, the racism and the poverty. So we said 14 things. I won't go through all of them, but just COVID relief and living wages and universal health care and funding adequate for education and infrastructure that's focused on climate change so that and targeted in low wealth communities and redoing the poverty line. So we actually measure and overturning the tax cuts from Trump that Trump did and 14 points. You can go to poorpeoplescampaign.org, your listeners, because we don't just curse the darkness, and in our 14 points, we unpack their argument. So we lay out the points and then we say, now, we know somebody's going to say this, so let us show you this. This is what the economists really say. For those that say, for instance, it costs too much, well, Joseph Stiglitz, a Nobel Peace Prize economist, has said that that's the wrong question. The real question in America is, what is the cost not to do it? What is the cost of inequality? Well, the deficit. Well, then we put another scholar who said there's this whole deficit myth that is always used when folk want to block help from the bottom up, but it's never discussed when we want to put more money in militarism and tax cuts. So we have that agenda out there, and I hope your listeners would actually go to it and sign on with us.
Definitely. Earlier, Reverend, you snuck some history tidbits in there, and I love history, and I have found looking back has actually really helped inform what's happening right now. And so I would love to hear from you, like which lessons from history, whether it be Reconstruction, the Civil Rights Movement, Ronald Reagan, but like what's really helpful in explaining and understanding where we are right now?
If we know history, we actually know how to defeat what we see now. And we might be able to defeat it with a sense of truth, love, and justice that actually will win over some folk. 70% or so, 2/3 of people, regardless of party, want living wages, want health care. I think that in this moment, it behooves us to, first of all, understand what happened post the Civil War to undermine Reconstruction, right? Eddie Glaude, my dear friend, the other day said on MSNBC, he said, the people we see today are the second redeemers. The redeemers were the people in around 1872 who decided it was time to take back America, make America great again, put it back in the hands of white folk again. That's what they literally said. And what did they do to do that? They first started calling for tax cuts. Then they spread lies, vicious conspiracy lies about what was really happening between Black and white politicians. Because, at 1868, almost every Southern state was either controlled by a majority Black group of legislature or a fusion coalition of Black and white folk working together. And what did they do? They rewrote constitutions. Like in North Carolina, they changed the Constitution. And this is how it opens, the preamble. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all persons, listen, not men, all persons are created equal, endowed by the Creator with certain inalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, the enjoyment of the fruit of their own labor, and the pursuit of happiness. This is the kind of they guarantee public education. They guarantee better labor laws. This is 1868, 69. They passed the 15th Amendment. They passed the 14th Amendment. Well, the Redeemers started saying it was their God right to take the country back. So they attacked voting. They wanted to cut taxes. They attacked the courts, started taking over the courts. And in 1876, they stole an election. The person who won the popular vote did not win. They slipped the person in through the Electoral College. And what did he do? He turned the South back over. So we've seen this before, maybe not exactly, but we've seen it before. And Dr. King said to us at the end of the Selma to Montgomery March, when he did his sermon, he said, every time there is the possibility for the Negro masses and white poor masses of the South to join together and build the beloved community and set in place a new political structure, listen, the aristocracy sows division, the wealthy sow division, they fund division. And he said that's what was happening in the 1800s. That's who was trying to block the Voting Rights Act. And it's the same way today. It's folk who are sowing. Take, for instance, you have a corporation that'll give $1 million to a civil rights organization today to say they support Black Lives Matter. But then on the other side, they're still supporting groups that are against living wages and health care. And they're still pushing for tax cuts that undermine the government. You see, so we have to be really shrewd in this moment well, not shrewd, we have to be really wise in this moment to understand what's going on. And America, we've seen it before. And then the last thing is, we cannot ever act as though this is an anomaly. Neil Painter, early on when Trump was first running, said Trump is simply the iconography of a too often repeated American reality. We take a few steps forward and then we take great steps back that is often violent and vicious. What you saw at the Capitol, I was just screaming at the TV when people say, we've never seen this but twice in America. Are you out of your mind? Poor folk, Black folk, labor, people fighting for women's suffrage, abolitionists, all knew this mob violence, this attack on our bodies and sacred place. What we saw, the world saw, was what finally happens when you seed racism and lies, and you keep seeding that stuff. Eventually it goes to a form of mob violence, right? So we have to stop this business. You know, I'm gonna defend Trump for a minute. Lord have mercy, what is wrong with me? Stop blaming, he couldn't have done this by himself. He did not create this. He was vomited up out of a sick system that was set in place 50 years ago. And by the way, I'll stop here. Do you know that Howard Dent, Pat Buchanan, Calvin Phillips told Richard Nixon, if we follow this plan of intentional dividing the country, we not only can control the South, which is 170 electoral votes, 31% of the United States House of Representatives, and 26 members of the United States Senate, we can control the white ethnic enclaves of the North, and we can control the country for the next 50 years. When they put this plan in place, that was intended to control for the next 50 years. But in this moment, we also see something else. Black Lives Matter, Sunrise, Poor People's Campaign. We just saw a campaign where an older Black man and a Black woman could run, and they could actually say, elect us, we're gonna expand healthcare. It didn't go far enough, we need universal. Elect us, we're gonna do 15 in the union. Elect us, we're gonna address systemic racism. And if there's three things they need to do, is do those first. They need to do what they said they were gonna do. And they prove you can run like that and win in California and in Georgia, right? 55% of poor and low wealth people voted for Biden Harris. Poor and low wealth people didn't put Trump in office. It's folk making 60 to 70,000 above, but 55% of poor and low wealth people, 6 million more poor and low wealth people voted this time than did in 2016. Poor and low wealth people make up almost a third of the electorate, 65 million people. That is the only place we can expand the electorate and change the electorate. And lastly, we've got to quickly do the Voting Rights Act, because right now there are 100 bills in state legislatures to suppress the vote, right now. And the reason they're filing them is because they know they don't have to deal with pre-clearance. So Biden, just as much as we're doing COVID relief, that bill, that Voting Rights Act bill, needs to be on the table ASAP, so we can stop this stuff and be prepared for the 22 election cycle.
Definitely. So we've got time for one more question. And something that has been on my mind and is probably on the minds of a lot of people watching right now is, last year, the convergence of the pandemic and the killing of George Floyd kind of felt like an awakening to like all of these problems that have been plaguing this country for a really long time. And they posted their black squares on Instagram, but now they're kind of like, oh, what do I do next? And so, Dr. Sharrelle and Rebekah, I was kind of wondering, like, what advice do you have for people who are new to this, but like really want to commit?
That's a good question. I mean, to just get involved, to find out what organizations are organizing, to read up about what the Poor People's Campaign is doing, Sunrise Movement. My dad mentioned a bunch of organizations, but to channel this energy and to realize that it's going to be a long struggle because it's already been a long struggle. But yeah, I know a lot of people. We were right there. George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, she was my age when she was killed. And we're realizing that we are fighting multiple pandemics all at once. So I would say, channel that energy, connect to an organization, and just, do what we have to do to remain engaged and to understand that this fight is going to continue, but we can win this fight if we also continue fighting.
Absolutely. And I mean, I agree that, this is a time to plug in. This is not a time to retreat, even with the, excitement around the election and the inauguration. We can't, this is a time to fight. And this is a time to join with organizations who've been doing this work, honoring that work, work like what the Poor People's Campaign has built over time, work that, both at the national and in local communities, Black Lives Matter movements have built. There are folks who've been fighting these systems and structures, and, this is a time to plug into those. And, I was so inspired by the poet laureate, and she talked about this idea of the light. Are we, and I'm paraphrasing, and I hate that I'm not catching it very, accurately, but, are we willing to see the light? And I think she says, are we willing to fight for the light or fight to be the light? And I think we have to be the light in this moment, right? We have to emerge from all that we've seen, especially with this pandemic. I talk about, my role as a social epidemiologist. Part of my job description is to count deaths. And it's been hard and heartbreaking to have to, bear witness to the amount of death that we've seen, both with the murders as well as with COVID-19 and so many other forms of death. And so we have to choose to be the light. We have to use our gifts. We have to join in the struggle, and not just for a day, not just for a week, not even just for a month. We have to commit to this for a lifetime. This is a lifetime struggle that we need to fight and be the light in this moment to push back the darkness. And we can do it, and we can do it. And that's what I would say. We have to commit to being the light and to collectively coming together in this moment.
Definitely. Reverend Barber, let me leave you with the last word here. Yeah. Any final advice you've got for folks?
Anywhere where people are doing moral fusion movements that are understanding, we have to deal with what we call the interlocking injustices. And it has to be multifaceted, multi-race, multi-religious, even people not of faith. Whether it's Black Lives Matter, the Poor People's Campaign, where people are saying we have to, you can't heal the nation without dealing with the sickness in the body. And we're dealing with these in a fusion way. These are not disconnected ideas. I'm saying to folks, we're going to deal with the racism, for instance, toward Black people, but don't leave out Latinos, don't leave out Indigenous people, because ultimately Black racism is not just targeted at Black people. It's a hatred for humanity. It's a hatred for democracy, it's a hatred for justice. Let's hook up cross movement. We're doing that now in Poor People's Campaign. We're hooking up cross movements. We've launched Moral Mondays now again, and we might not be able to gather this year, but in 2022, we're going to have a mass Poor People's Assembly, low-wage workers, and a national Moral March on Washington to build power and to change the narrative. Secondly, I've been living in this pandemic by not being able to see the children with the ancestors, and one of them I've been living with and having quite a bit of conversation with in my own personal mysticism is Frederick Douglass. And what I cannot find among him and many others is language of despair. Now, they did tell the truth. They did say how ugly things were. There were times that they hurt, but he always had another voice. And for instance, after the Dred Scott decision, when everybody thought that it was all over, they asked Frederick Douglass to speak 2 months later. He said how monstrous and ugly. He said everybody's against us, the marshals, the government, the force, armed force, everything. But then he said, but I meet this with a cheerful spirit, because could this be a necessary link in the chain of events preparatory to the downfall of the whole system? Therefore, let us look at our history. No efforts to, every effort to ally, to stop the abolition movement has only served to embolden and intensify our agitation. Let it be so again. And I think that's where we have to be in this moment, that some of the things we're seeing are not they're not the death pangs, P-A-N-G, of the democracy. They are the birth pains of a greater democracy and a greater freedom. You know, death pangs hurt, and so do birth pains hurt. But in South Africa, they used to say, only a dying mule kicks the hardest. Only a dying mule kicks the hardest. So could this, Nathalie, be for you, Sharrelle, me, Rebekah, and all others? Could this be a moment of birth pains? Could these be necessary links in the chain of events to the downfall of the entire systems of racism and poverty? Could the exposing actually be a call to action? Could it force people that have been kind of, you know, back straddling the fence to say, we can't do that anymore? And if so, if they are birth pains, and I do believe they are in many ways, then let's push. And finally, breathing. You know, what COVID and George Floyd have in common is George Floyd was a low-wage worker who moved to that community trying to find work. He didn't have insurance. And that knee on his neck, that lynching, stopped his breathing. And what does COVID do? It stops our breathing. I'm asking everybody I know to do something I've tried to do, maybe not as well as it should, but I've tried to ask this question. It's a hard question sometimes. Why am I still alive? In the midst of a time when anybody could, 7 minutes, your breath could be gone, 7 days, a week, you could get COVID and your whole system, some people's systems are, boom, it's gone, bloom. You could be in the ICU and over, nobody ever did. Why are you still breathing? And it can't be because we're better than other folk. We know that 60% of people didn't have to die. Why are we still breathing? And then the next question is, if I am, what's worthy of my breath? What is it that I should not waste one breath doing? Maybe I should not waste one breath on evil and racism and meanness and hatred and injustice. But every breath I take should be a commitment to love, to truth, to mercy, to justice. And what if we all breathe together and create what one poet called this glorious hurricane of transformation with our breath? And what if we say, whether we have 7 more minutes, 7 more days, 7 more weeks, 7 more months, or 70 more years, from here forward, I'm only going to use my breath in ways that breathes more justice, more love, more truth, more possibility into this society. You know, let's breathe together, and let's breathe together to cause this democracy, not just to go back to where it was, but let's breathe fresh life, fresh liberty, fresh justice into it for generations that are yet unborn.
I think I speak for a lot of people when I say that those final words will definitely stay with me for a while. Obviously, we could talk forever. I personally could do this all day, but we are getting close to the end of our time together. So again, I just want to take a moment to really thank you guys for joining us today. Reverend Dr. Barber, Dr. Sharrelle, Rebekah, you guys were amazing. Love your family dynamics. And really, I can't thank you enough. This was really incredible. And I know that a lot of people appreciate that you guys were able to join us again. So thanks for having
me. What's that you called my daughters at the beginning? And what's that? I can't say it because I'm a preacher, but man, I'd like to hear you say it one more time.
Let me go ahead and remind you guys of the Reverend Dr. Barber's 2 cool-ass daughters.
That's right, that's right.
Rebekah.
All right. Thank you.
So once again, thanks guys, and I hope we can all chat again soon.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Take care. Forward together.
Not one
Now,
step
one step
back.
back.
Once again, guys, I'm Nathalie Baptiste. I'm a reporter and columnist for Mother Jones. You can watch this event again on YouTube or motherjones.com in case you want to go back, pick up, reread, listen to any of the advice that we heard today. And also, I want to give a huge thank you to our live stream sponsor, Beneficial State Bank. Don't forget to follow along for all of our coverage on the fight for racial justice, and hopefully see you all virtually very soon.